Okay. So I have a little adventure that I've
Hmm.
been on recently. This comes from one of my missions, out in the world as I was calling in from various numbers station on shortwave filtered through 10 different proxies and doing that whole super mission shit. Okay. So for some stuff that will by necessity remain unnamed, I needed some very funny dirt from inside of a graveyard. And I had to get this dirt at a very particular time in the evening when they're not super fond of being in graveyards.
It's always sucks when like cemeteries have like times that they close because some don't. Some are completely like a public park essentially. And
Hmm.
others are like, oh, it's 5 p.m. we're done. And so when you have traditions that require you to work at night, that's pretty lame. So like you and I are no stranger to like hopping fences or even like picking locks and jiggling things and so on. But in this case specifically, it had to be really into the night.
Yeah, it was late. It was well after midnight in the witching hour proper, if you will.
But there's also like, I mean, what like when are there ever guards around then, right? Who even patrols at that time? Well, usually no. Like, I mean, yes, there are some night shift people, but like in the place that you were going to, because I've been there too, like like absolutely not.
Yeah, so that's the weird part. So I'm wandering through, do my thing, and stop in the middle of this giant intersection to make some offerings, be like, cool, thanks for the first thing I did going well, let's move on to the second thing. And right, of course, as I'm standing in the middle of the road, got my like bag strung over my shoulder, got my tools and stuff out, just like vibing, black SUV gunning it down the road right toward me in the middle of this cemetery.
Oh
And I'm
no.
like, shit. So I book it. I'm like doing all these like invisibility charms and all this other bullshit to
You're
like
holding
get
your
these.
thumbs.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
The just telling all these people just like, okay, get off me, throwing powders and things out of my bag onto the graves. Some of them
Hmm.
like being like, like help out whoever's taking this offering, like, I have fed you well. Go do this.
Do not
and
forget
and
me.
literally. So I'm running through this graveyard, and as I'm doing so, I'm like, okay, I gotta remember that I'm here doing magician shit. I'm not here doing criminal shit,
Hmm. Hmm.
So I just kind of like pause for a moment, just ducking behind this grave as I hear this like engine revving up, like going around the roads, and I'm like, okay, spirits, what do I do? How do I get out of here? And they're like, complete the mission.
Oh yeah, I mean, the line between magician and criminal can be very thin sometimes, and in some places like, deliberately one and the same. But in this case, you were like, I'm not here, doing things that spicy, at least not as spicy as I usually am doing. I'm just getting some dirts, and then
Exactly.
God's most late night patrolling soldier shows up and starts like chasing you down, and also like actually chasing you. This isn't just like a guy who is doing his little rounds. Like
Mhm.
he saw you and he was going for you.
Yeah, so that was not the greatest thing in the world. So I'm like, all right, let's get this guy off me. So I run over to this tree that I've done a bunch of bullshit to and have, installed certain spirits into and around and
Hmm.
called them forth. And I'm like, all right, guys, I need some help. Get this guy off me.
Hmm.
And we have a little chat, the spooky man in the tree and I, and all of a sudden he's like, okay, I got you. And a bat just out of nowhere flying in the direction of the guard. And I'm like, all right, thanks, man. And just book it.
He like hits the windshield, like blurs this guy's
Oh my god,
vision.
yeah.
He's like freaking out. You're running away. You're getting your dirts along the way because like you're a free man now.
Yeah, I'm like, Dobby is a free elf who can complete super soldier stay behind missions in the nuclear wasteland.
No, Gladio Key.
Yeah.
Oh my god.
So yeah, just get my stuff and I'm like, okay, how do I get out of here? And they're like, well, the bat has done his duty, so you can just walk right out the front door.
For the listeners, I just want you all to know that when Key got home, in his car, and like he sent us the sweatiest Snapchat ever. Like it was literally like him, eyes blurry, like glistening, retelling the story, which I love hearing it because like one, not the spiciest thing ever that's happened to any of us in a cemetery, but definitely one of the funniest. Just sort of like how the spirit that called you over chose to resolve this issue. It's like, go gadget bat.
Send a bat to get hit by a car.
Hey, if it works, it works.
Oh my god, yeah. Shout outs to that guy.
Shout outs to him indeed. And shout outs to you and Salt about to give us a little bit of a tour into some history of scrying and a little bit about spirit contact and how you too can get yourself out of tricky situations with a friend of some invisible allies on the other side.
Be not alarmed by the frightful owls you may hear. It be Salt, Svinger, and Beryl Stone Key. Why the beryl? Because it was probably the most common type of stone used to scry after just plain glass in magical literature. It's kind of like quintessential scrying stone.
I like Beryl Stone Key. That's cute. We didn't. It was you who made up the bee this time.
It was. It's a bit calmer than what we might usually see from Mr. Grave Invader,
Yeah. Also cute. You're a bit of a lapidary man. Like you know your stones.
I'm a stone enjoyer.
I literally knew you were gonna say that. Like I heard in my head, like you're gonna be like, I'm a stone enjoyer. One does enjoy getting stoned. Yeah, you'd be scrying in the fingernails, you'd be scrying in the stones, you'd be scrying in the oil lamps.
Luckily, I'm not an enjoyer of scrying into the fingernails of children conscripted into the
into the child seer role, yeah, designated child seer. No, not necessary. Mercifully, you've been my seer a few times when like we've deliberately chosen to do grimoire stuff where like one of us is going to be the conjurer and the other the seer, which it doesn't work the way you think it works. It's not like the conjurer literally sees nothing. Like you're going to see stuff, but the one person will be like actively perhaps doing the kind of augury divination to confirm certain things that are being said. But you and I have had like straight up mind reading telepathy psychic moments in a grimoire circle together. Karanthon and Muthian was a major one, right? The experiment of drawing a spirit into the glass, because like we wrote about that on the blog, but it was pretty intense how we both heard the exact same things. Like when you were negotiating a certain planetary thing, I heard the same planet that you were saying, and it was mostly auditory. Like there was a lot of visuals with it, but like it's one thing to be like, oh, one person receives an impression of like the symbol of the planet and the other one gets the name or gets like the mood or gets a plant from the planet or gets like something, that kind of conscripts the mood of it, but like we were both actually genuinely hearing things at the same time, and at one point like reading each other's thoughts or like anticipating them. It was a great time. I think it was the time bending, like reality warping effect of that particular ritual and what those angels are said to do that help with it, because the character does change depending on the hour, right? So like when it switched over into the next planetary hour, while the original atmosphere was definitely extended, it started to take on a different quality as well. So I don't know, I always think of that as like an interesting example of like when you try to have like dual roles in that way. Like not that grimoires need you to be in set roles, like some of them, like Tuba Veneris just says like one person conjures and the others sit around or stand around like in silence. Other times you do have designated roles. Sometimes you just can both conjure and both see the same thing at the same time, as you and I have often done. But in this case, it was interesting that it was just so fluid. Like there was no awkwardness or muddling around with like, what's happening? Are you seeing what I'm seeing in the glass with the sun hitting it just right? It was pretty awesome.
Or just like completely anticipating. It's like, oh, some spirit is kind of wilding out on the side of the circle, handing each other like knives and wands and stuff while the other conjures. It's just this flow back and forth. was cool.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very dynamic process, right? Like, I mean, I think that's the thing that people don't get about conjuration is it's dynamic. Everything's constantly kind of in flux.
And it's the beginning, right? It's the inception, if you will. Like, that's when you form the pack. The rest happens outside of it. The rest of, like, how will you come when I call you again? You know, what are the shortcuts? What are your hand gestures? What are your secret signs? What are the names that if I call these in this particular voice, or if I whisper them in this particular way to these leaves, like, you will be there, you'll be present, you know? It's not just about repeating the ceremony. It takes a lot of effort to put together. You know, it's about, like, how that is like the price that you pay to get contact, and now what, you know?
It's like one of the first things we always, ask and encourage other people to ask. It's like, okay, I went through all the bullshit of like getting this exact hour, this exact time. How do I call you whenever I want?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because, like, the three of us, like, grimoires are not our main practice at all. You know, like, we write about them because it's a bit more available to us. Like, we all have like weird witchcraft pacts that we can't really write on or speak on much. Like, you know, our folk magics are very culturally indebted to where our practices arise out of, you know, other traditions that we're pursuing or initiated in. We either aren't comfortable talking about them, and some things we'll never talk about publicly because it's good to have an ace in the hole, you know, something that you know that nobody else knows that you do, right? You know, but in this case, I feel like it's easier for us to write about things like PGM and grimoires in some senses because the audience will already have the necessary kind of background, you know, into what those things are. But these examples, I think, are really helpful in illuminating some of the ways that spirits communicate in sometimes, like, when you least expect it, or in ways that you really don't think will happen, you know, in dreams in which you will never see the spirit visible. It's just they are the dream. Every character in the dream, everything that happens, including the speed of, you know, the way that the clouds move or the speed of the wind is the spirit, you know, versus times when it's very literal in terms of there's a voice, there's a manifested appearance, you know, it's happening, you know. And I'm excited to hear you guys speak on this. I'm still away. Those of us who are patrons know that we're kind of scattered around the world right now. So I'm away from my usual mic, but I'm here. I'm hanging out and calling in from a distance, being the tertiary frightful howl in this situation. But I am really excited to hear you guys talk a little bit about your tips and tricks. This is something that you guys have been working on, as well as Salt, especially, just kind of like, what are some of your experiences with this as someone who's really gone into the history of, you know, the actual theories behind the cosmologies of spirit sight and what it means for our spiritual organs, our senses, our body, or difference between soul and spirit, you know, especially in Western philosophy and so on.
So yeah, spirit contact's been something I've been pretty passionate about for a long time now, and especially looking into the history and contextual influences that have kind of shaped how we perceive it as a practitioner. Because, you know, I've had my own difficulties in it. Like, I'm not someone who just, you know, woke up one day and could speak to spirits. You know, it's a process, and I think it's one that this kind of contextual historical background was kind of a way to help me overcome some of these issues that I had with the actual process of doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're blessed to be able to remember that it's an ongoing process. You know, it's an eternal cultivation, and explicitly so. You know, I just spent the last little while talking to a good friend of mine who grew up around a lot of different traditions, including Lukumi, you know, Orisha, around Palo, around Espiritismo. And he was really sharing with me how even going to Misa Espirituales, you know, when he was very young, cultivating his mediumship was extremely encouraged, you know, and that was something that was continually emphasized as, you know, an ongoing lifetime pursuit, right? There's no like end goal where you're like, now I can see my spirits, you know. And also, you know, your mood, your diet, your what you ate that morning, you know, all this affects the timbre of your voice when you're singing, right? You know, let alone your ability to perceive, you know, subtle forces, right? You know, and so as much as spirits can be very unsubtle sometimes, we've all had our, you know, experiences of spirits just manifesting out of nowhere and just scaring, you know, the shit out of us. It's one of the, it's important to remember that, you know, this is not something where like, oh, you know, here's an easy 3-step guide and like, there you are, you know. It's about, you know, a constant checking in or reflecting on your own nature and your own abilities, you know. I find that nothing helps more than remembering the importance of discernment, because you can project your fantasies, your desires, what you think mediumship is like what you want it to be like onto any spirit, what you want from them, what you think that they are, what your commitments are. Like they have to be from this culture, they have to be this kind of spirit, they must be, like I'm not going to accept any ants other than this is what you are. And as soon as you think you know what a spirit is, they're going to change. I find that as soon as you become comfortable in putting it in a box, they're going to do something to be like, to prove you wrong in some way, that there's so much more than that, and that comes from any tradition. So I think that having that flexibility is essential, and also just the humility to be like, you will never, occult means hidden, like you will never have all the answers, you will never fully understand any spirit, and nor should you. Should everyone ever understand you fully? We all have our unspoken and pacts and agreements.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's kind of like learning a language, right? Like
Mhm.
the way that the spirits communicate with us. I mean, it can vary between a spirit, and not only that, but even the way the spirit speaks, it will change. As you grow
Mhm.
older, your voice breaks, you start speaking differently, and sometimes as the relationship changes, the way the spirit communicates with us changes. As maybe they feel, maybe comfortable is not the right word here, but they're more willing to express themselves in certain ways that they wouldn't necessarily do to someone who's only been familiar with them for a few months and hasn't really engaged with them much. It's kind of a back and forth, a relationship, and also a language of sorts.
100%, yeah.
Yeah, there's like the constant interplay as well, as you guys are saying, where as the relationship evolves, so too does the spirit evolve, is another thing to be keeping constantly in mind, as you're really highlighting, where the pursuit of our own mediumship is definitely the lifelong goal, but also in the course of our interactions with these spirits and entities and things like that, they are also evolving in their manner to communicate with us. Like it's a two-way street where we aren't just punching into a spirit world, they're also coming to us. So it's kind of the intricate navigation of that middle ground on a incredibly idiosyncratic basis between your own makeup and the makeup of whatever spirit you're cultivating that relationship with, that really makes this far longer than just a one lifetime pursuit.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I love that you phrase it that way, because maybe your capacity at a given time, because of your upbringing or because of your assumptions about things, is to be like, the spirit is clearly an ancestor, and only later do you realize that actually they may have ancestralized elements to their nature. They may they may borrow deeply of human lifetimes and human memories, but maybe they're not actually human. They're just representing that way to you, or that's the capacity in which you're able to engage with them, understand them at this moment, because that's where you are right now. But in time, they will reveal deeper mysteries, and it's not like a character in a video game where you just spam the dialogue options that make them tell you their life story immediately, right? You're gonna, it could be 20 years before you even know certain things. And so, yeah, I'm very appreciative of these conversations I've been having recently, in learning a bit more about the way that mediumship is just ongoing development for everybody. But with that said, so I want to hand it off to you in terms of some of the notes that you prepared for us to share today.
Yeah, so I think folks should probably have developed a little bit of an idea on how we see spirit contact from the little conversation we just had. It's a bit of a meandering maze of different subjects and paths, but the labyrinth ultimately has the same destination. And what we touched on is only the most basic. There's a whole lot that goes into it, from divination and confirming visions to discernment and distinguishing. Self-awareness is very important for that. The ability to listen and quiet in a way that's organic, physical appearance and sensations, or omens, weather changes, temperature changes, all this plays a role in spirit contact. But that's not just the case now, it's also the historical attitude, which is kind of what I want to talk about in this episode before I hand things over to Mr. Key. That is to say, how did folks way back when view communication with spirits, and how did they go about that? Because I think a lot of people are hesitant around a very particular topic, and that is whether this communication has to be physical in some way or capacity. The reality is that even in our historical sources, many times, and I won't say every source agrees or that this is a homogeneous attitude, the experience of communicating with the spiritual is not limited to the material senses. The senses are merely one way which the communication occurs, but it's evident from the relevant materials that there's a kind of communication occurring via the mind, the soul, the two faculties of fantasy and imagination, which I think a lot of folks are suspicious about because they've heard XYZ talk about using physical appearances, and that's not really how it went down, even historically. You practice hard enough, do the rites properly, and yeah, physical appearances will come, sure. Especially when it becomes a necessity, such as saving someone's life. That's when I saw my first spirit physically appearing. But are we really going to pretend that it happens every time? What about spirits who are too removed from physical reality to appear to the visible eyes and don't want to stain themselves in matter? Angels come to mind there, right? Are we just going to tell them to shut off because we can't see or hear them? I think it's ideal, is it now, for a magician to see things that way? So let's think about this and what means are they going to use to communicate with us? Because odds are, since they're themselves spirits and souls, they're going to communicate with us by means of our own soul, our own spirit, perhaps even.
Yeah, and I think something important that you to raise here is the context that you're referring to is like in Western magic, especially like early modern Western magic. But I think that in any kind of magic, no matter what you're doing with spirits, visible appearance is one thing, but even full on like spirit contact, obviously being a sufficient of trance to divine for sure, but like being like seeing and feeling a spirit is actually not necessary for magic to work. Sometimes you can have like incredible results. You feel nothing, you're cranky, you ate a lot of fast food, you're just in front of your shrines praying, laying out candles and doing, all kinds of things to get a result. And it still happens, maybe because the spirit is still there. You have to trust that they're there. If you have a seated spirit in the tradition, if you have a very cultivated shrine, if you've been tending to that shrine for multiple years, if you have fetishes for them, if they're like placed, if they have like points of access for certain things, they are there. You have to remember that, if you know how to call them and they come, even if you're off on your game and don't really feel them, it doesn't mean that they're not listening. Sometimes like I've called one of my spirits that is very, very present, very seated, if you will, and I don't feel them particularly at all. And I later on realized like they were sitting on the roof, lingering, like coiling and listening to me, and whatever I asked for within the week, it still manifested. But in some ways that was a test for me too, as someone who's practiced mediumship a fair bit, and has had plenty of experiences with seeing spirits when I was a child, inconsistently, of course, but nevertheless something that I've developed further in my time. It's not one of those things where like you get so caught up in wanting to experience that it negates your ability to even engage or be willing to engage rather with sorcery in the first place.
Definitely. I mean, we can't say, oh yeah, this vicar doesn't hear God, so he obviously doesn't have a connection with God, right? Like it's It's also about orthopraxy and practicing what you preach. Like it's communication is crucial, but it's not the only ingredient that comes into it. I think some people can sometimes see being able to talk to spirits as like this panacea, this ultimate medicine, and definitely it can be a medicine. It can be a cure for many ills, but it's kind of like seeing a nurse or a doctor. It's a matter of talking to them and knowing what you need, but then you also need to put that into practice as well. So with all this in mind, today we're going to start with looking at the concepts of mind and soul and so on in a Renaissance worldview, because I think it's the most approachable period of history, especially as it relates to spirit contact, because we have a lot of philosophical texts dealing in related topics, and it's also pretty close to the era of witch trials, where we hear a lot about people cavorting with spirits, and frankly, Renaissance humanism has had a massive impact on the development of Western magic, to the point that it is sometimes, not even sometimes, frankly, quite often overemphasized a little. And I say that as someone who loves this particular line of thought, but keep in mind as well that the overview that we're going to present here is a little bit simple. A more in-depth discussion on the subject is forthcoming one day, but it's a very heavy topic, and right now would be a distraction to the meat and bones, which is talking about spirits and spirit contact. But I think it's helpful to touch on it a little. And afterwards, we're going to talk about some particular cases that evidence the visionary nature of spirit contact and how we might distinguish it from physicality. And then I'm going to hand the rest of the episode over to Mr. Key to take charge in discussing the practical elements.
Oh, he's Mr. Key now.
In teacher mode, it's Mr. Key.
Oh, that's Mr. Key to you, young man. Check out episode 4, 6 Degrees of Tom Dryberg for that story. Honestly, this has been like something that's been on my mind for a while, just in my personal life, and just where considering, what I've been doing for the past few weeks, as you gentlemen know. So I definitely can. I don't want to like take over and talk about it for too long, so I'm going to redirect back to you, Salt, because I know you have a lot prepared. And I know this is a subject that, much like as we keep hinting with the eventual, 70 episodes we'll do on werewolves and on different kinds of like witchcraft traditions, and certainly on, on scrying itself, this is going to be an enduring topic. Even like I love how helpful your framing of the kind of exorcism in antiquity episode was, episode 2, because it was just so helpful to have, some kind of cushioning in terms of the more specialized forms and time periods of exorcisms that we'll look into, including going back to antiquity to look at, certain aspects of Babylonian exorcisms, certain aspects of, Syriac exorcisms, and so on. So I think this is going to be very exciting. So I definitely feel like creeping up that, we're going to just go off topic. So I know, with Renaissance and early modern stuff in the West, just so much you can talk about, right? You can talk about child scrying, which has been our joke of the episode. We can talk about John Dee, certainly the excellent book of the art of magic, Faustian stuff where you look into, glasses of water. We can look into spiritism and traditions of spiritualism in France and in Italy and so on. There's so much we could talk about without even getting into the folk stuff. And it's too broad a topic, obviously, to go into one episode, but you have a really great framing for us in terms of understanding some of these traditions, which is why I thought of this episode as kind of a miscellany, because much like exorcism and much like shapeshifters and much like grimoires and witchcraft, this is going to be an enduring topic and we'll have specialist episodes in it, but it's good to have like an opening framing one to refer to when we get into like the really nitty gritty of certain things. So I'll hand it back to you. I know you have a lot to say, and I'm really excited to hear all about it.
Yeah, so honestly, I think the Renaissance is just the right era to deal with the topic because, like you said, we have John Dee, we have the excellent book, we have also got a wide range of sources and philosophical texts that are kind of dealing in topics relevant to the subject. And we also, it's pretty close to the era of witch trials, where we hear a lot about people cavorting with spirits. And frankly, Renaissance humanism has had a massive impact on the development of Western magic to the point that it's sometimes even a little bit overemphasized. I want to note to the readers that keep in mind, I'm going to simplify things here. A more in-depth discussion on the subject is probably forthcoming one day, but it's a very heavy topic, and right now would be a distraction to the meat and bones, which is seeing spirits. But I think it's going to be helpful to touch on a little. And afterwards, we're going to talk about some particular cases to evidence the visionary nature of spirit contact and how we might distinguish it from physicality, even at times. And then I'm going to hand the rest of the episode over to Mr. Key to take charge. So, to start with, I'm going to focus on the concept of mind and soul and so on. And what are these things within the lens of Renaissance thought? The answer is going to depend on who you ask. There's not a homogeneous perspective. And whilst in the Middle Ages, scholastic thought could be pretty carefully regulated in the universities with relatively stable curriculums, by the Renaissance this was disturbed a little. The intellectual sphere opened to a more varied discourse, and after the release of episode 3, The Return of Plato, spearheaded by astrologian, clergyman, magician, musician, and physician, Marsilio Ficino, a wonderful mind. So there's a lot of chaos, and saying there's only one homogeneous take would be pretty foolish. But we can point to common trends, and generally around this time we have this kind of division of labour. Aristotle's work, especially the physics and the Kalo and on generation and corruption, can be seen as a kind of key to understanding the natural world. And both Aristotle and Galen, as well as Arabic sources like Ibn Sina, would provide us with understanding of the physical body in medicine. On the other hand, the divine Plato would usually be the respected authority on metaphysics. So when we look at Ficino, for example, what we get is a really fascinating blend of Aristotelian physics and nature, but also interpretations of the soul based on Platonic thought. And for medicine, we also see a strong influence out of Galen, and alongside him comes adoptions of Stoicism, or at least evolutions and components of it. And you can see Walker's Ficino and Spiritual Magic for more information on Ficino's very fascinating perspective as a kind of summary. His Platonic Theology is also a wonderful book. And for the more magically and pragmatically minded, 3 Books on Life, which is kind of a very sophisticated text on how to live a good life.
Okay, but so, I love 3 Books on Life.
It is wonderful, yeah. Everything Ficino touches just turns to gold in my mind. Like, I know people give a lot of flack to Christian Platonists, but I don't care. I love it. I love it.
Well, I think, Christian Platonism is so much more, than the Renaissance, right? I mean, Christians were engaging with Platonism from the beginning. In fact, Platonism and Platonic theurgy were like a major competing pagan force, if you will, to Christian attempts to convert Gentiles, right? Because like Iamblican theurgy was extremely attractive to many pagans who were a little dissatisfied with some of their cultic practices and were drawn to sort of metaphysical approaches, drawn to the soteriology of Christianity and to what it was offering, especially with the lack of needing to necessarily adhere to Jewish customs and, taboos. But at the same time, it was hard to convert to something that was so new, especially something that required you to, in some ways, join a new community of people and be cut off from the state, from its politics, from its veneration of deities, from emperor, from the ability to go visit like a sports arena just because there were deities that patroned the arena and so on. So, it was a real contender. And, even without getting into Pseudo Dionysius and everything like that, there were many people who were in dialogue with Platonists in that era, of late antiquity. And it was a constant resurgence over time, with even as certain Christians distanced themselves in certain eras from what they saw as corrupting pagan influences. You cannot take the Platonism out of the tradition. And by the time we get the revival, people are rediscovering, long after Aquinas's, experiences with, just going into Aristotle in such a deeper and in dialogue with so many Muslim scholars as well, and Arabic sources which preserve these dialogues. We have now this understanding that, well, Christian Platonism is so much more than just kind of like a vehicle for other streams of theology. It's a cosmology in and of itself.
Truly, truly. And I mean, even in Aquinas' case, where he's quite clearly Aristotelian, I remember reading very recently, I can't recall the name of the article, but the author basically said he's a lot more Platonist than he thinks he is, which
yeah. I mean, there's many good academic texts now looking into the actual theory behind astrology, within the medieval mind and within the mind of the Renaissance, and looking into not just like the sources and how diverse they are, but the coherence of a lot of the worldview of the divine kind of soul as it exists. But there's an entire, as you have always done really well in your writings to point out, there's an entire worldview here that provides a kind of context that otherwise for other traditions would be filled out by more direct oral lineage.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing when you're, practicing from, again, the word Western is obviously not ideal, but you're coming from a culture where magic is kind of done very discreetly. There's not exactly many teachers you can go to that teach and know how to practice a certain grimoire. And in that case, where do you go? Well, you have to educate yourself on, frankly, a ridiculous amount if you want to develop that kind of understanding. Now, is that understanding necessary? Not necessarily, not strictly. I mean, some of the best practitioners out there that I know are kind of like, I don't give a fuck what 15th century man said. Like, I believe in modern medicine, all that kind of stuff. It's like, okay, that's fair. And they put the work in and, hey, they seem to be doing fine. But for a lot of us, it's out of love of the tradition, out of love of the topic, but also it has its merits, it has its practical benefits and influences. And
it is a demonstration of love to your spirits in your case as well, to get really into the roots of a lot of these things that you're learning. Like I remember you showing me, why do you calculate? Why is it that you didn't feel comfortable giving readings to clients in astrology before you were able to calculate the charts by hand and even draw them out by hand? It's because you felt that was a proof of your love to your spirits, who taught you how to see deeper into the stars and how to understand them more deeply than just your source texts. Like that was a part of it, and I find that incredibly admirable.
I think it's it's appropriate, right, to just, you see your tradition, you see your practice, and you wanna examine it, how it's been done prior. Like, just like someone in a more communal setting, which is obviously the ideal, is going to look at their elders, their teachers, and be like, okay, let's take all this in, let's drink it all in. I want to learn, I want to know. And yeah, so I think that's kind of the value in looking back. So as far as the idea of context, it's definitely a bit of a clusterfuck in this period, because there's a lot of competing ideas. For example, when we talk about spirit, there's the orthodox medical view, which is a little simpler, and then there's the less orthodox view, which kind of has two different components, one being the organic spirit and the other part being what we call actually today as a cold practitioners the astral body, which is itself rooted in Plato. Yeah, again, his name comes up. So let's get to the point here. I think, and to simplify things and to keep things in layman's terms, the soul is the animating principle of life, as Aquinas puts it. To set a dumb example, you can move your arm right now, dear listeners, and if you think about that motion, did the body move itself without any kind of thought or cognition? No, there was something going on there, right? And there's something controlling the meat suit, so to speak. And that is the soul, at least the upper layers of that are the soul, and its rational faculty, the capability of reasoning, making judgments on things that writers in this period love to overcomplicate. The entire worldview is frankly Occam's razor, is something we love today, but back then keeping things simple was not necessarily how things went. And we have these layers and layers, the great chain of being and so on. But essentially, yes, you are a cognitively capable thinking machine, and that is the identity of the soul as the agent of the mind or ideas. But this soul has many different capacities. On one hand, with this pure, capable component of the soul, which is the power of reasoning and thought, the seat of cognition. And this is a kind of pure thought of reasoning. You also have the divine, unmoving power of intellect, immutable and reflective of the true essential nature, as well as united with the other forms or angel. But there's also a kind of subordinate soul that deals with the inner senses, and we find a similar notion in Plotinus when he talks about the lower soul. And Ficino and Co-Agrippa as well call this the idola or idol. And the job of this idol is to report things that the body sees to the cognitive power and to give suggestions on what to do about it. So let's say we see a burger and our stomach expressed hunger. Should we eat? And the soul's going to make a decision on that.
Which is so deeply Plato, Phaedrus. Republic, Symposium, Timaeus, Borger, yeah.
So the powers of this idola are divided into a lot of parts, and don't worry, we're not going to spend too long here. But for example, the memory, the communicensus or common senses. But most relevant of all here today are the imagination and its related power, the fantasy. So the imagination is kind of a bank of things that you've seen. It's kind of like, this is the information that the senses have collected about the world, and now it's sitting in the soul. And you also have the fantasy, which is taking that and using it in a creative function. It's kind of like the creative faculty of the lower soul. So if we've seen a goat and a fish, right, the imagination now has an image of a goat and a fish, but a fantasy can construct an image of a sea goat, combining the two images, i.e. Capricorn, right? So now you can imagine Capricorn. And because these images or physical appearances are information we derive from the senses, just as people with impaired vision from birth don't see things in the mind, but they might hear or feel things in their imagination still, it's kind of, it kind of plays that kind of role where they're not necessarily going to be able to visualize things if they can't see. So we have these faculties of the soul, and the entire basis of elite magic practiced in the Renaissance is intimately related to the soul and its capacity for magic. The soul kind of moves itself in directions. For example, if you want to engage with the planet Mars, well, the soul's going to move towards him. It seeks him out. And it might do this by instructing the physical body, by directing the body to things that are sympathetic to Mars, such as ritually preparing weapons that color red, burning, and spicy herbs, incense blends that include animals and vegetables belonging to his orders. And all of these things possess their own souls as well. And these souls are also riding in his chariot, so to speak. And there's a kind of harmony thereby which one soul is joined to another. If these souls are joined together, you'd think that they can communicate, right? And maybe my practitioner's coming out here, but this very unity itself is arguably a kind of communication. If we appeal to the star of Venus wearing dirty clothes, those clothes are a kind of antipathy to her and her nature. Venus likes clean things, she likes perfume, right? So the soul is going to feel that antipathy, that distance created by the wearing of unclean clothing, since Venus delights in clean and fragrant things. It's not verbal communication necessarily, but there's certainly a kind of communication, just like someone shifting away from you on the bus could be a communication, right? And this can happen on multiple levels of the soul. So, for example, and to be clear, we are moving from Renaissance 4 here to my own arguments based on this for a short divergence. We can look at the Ars Notoria. You'll see all that magic meant for memory. And it's interesting because the memory, as we know, is a faculty of the idol of the lower soul. So we see clearly there's something acting upon the soul, an external agent of some kind. And well, why could it not also act upon the fantasy or imagination by the same logic? And in the same sense, they can also act upon our spirit body, which is, to at least Ficino and Agrippa, a kind of physical but not too physical body that kind of bridges the soul and the body itself together. And it's kind of subtle, like an actual spirit's body. And its role is to act as the intermediary between the body and the soul, and itself is a concept closely related to the Stoic idea of pneuma. And this spirit has two parts, the pure and the etherical portion, which is, like we mentioned earlier, kind of like the what evolved into the modern idea of the astral body. It's the same stuff the stars are made from. It can be identified with Plato's chariot, and there's a lot of room to discuss this as it relates to astrology, given its astral origins. And you also have the more turbid parts of the spirit, which we could say is composed of the more rarefied forms of the force humours as a very vapory essence. And these two things coexist. And there's also the sensible power of spirit, which moves through the nerves, inhabits the brains, and it reports the information of the senses to the idler, as well as the vital power in the heart and so on, and the natural power. But in early modern anatomy, these are all kind of responsible for the functioning of the body and intaking information. And these come from Galenic and Aristotelian thought. So I don't want to spend too much time here, but essentially we know that there is a sensible power of the soul, which is resemblant to the sensible power of spirit. It's the coordination of senses, the capacity for feeling pleasure, joy, fear, pain, and this is often called the animal brute soul as well by Aristotle. And we have the vegetable power of the soul, which is kind of the soul that plants would have, and eventually devoid of feeling, more so functioning kind of unconsciously, keeping the organs running, for example. The point of this is kind of that we might see spiritual intelligences press upon these various souls or spirits and upon these faculties in order to produce effects. For example, a craving for cigarettes, even though you hate tobacco or don't smoke yourself. Cravings for alcohol, despite being straight edge, or certain foods like spices and peppers. Spirits will talk through those as well, especially spirits who are a little closer to the bodily, like ghosts, nature spirits, the souls of plants, for example.
My godfather made a really good point recently. We were talking about, just like tobacco being such a favorite plant of many of the issues. And obviously being something that we smoke a great deal, but it's also a martial plant. It spoils the breath, it spoils the tongue. And it's, many magicians smoke across traditions, right? But it does spoil the breath. It makes it more aggressive, makes the packs that you swear more aggressive, can be a difficult force to carry in the breath when you're making certain baths for cooling, when you're making certain things to kind of soothe the spirit and so on, to soothe the spirit of someone who is undergoing the ceremony. It's difficult, right? If a spirit, comes down and possesses somebody and smokes much tobacco, that becomes a very sacred implement. It could be added to powders, the ashes of it, But at the same time, it's something that will move the sensory abilities in a certain direction. And, when you're conjuring, when you're doing things, oftentimes tobacco fasts are really important. Even if you're a regular smoker, making sure you're not having it on your breath can be really important, because some spirits can be really offended by that. And the character of what you say, the prayers that you put on herbs, the herbs that you put in your mouth to chew and to add to things, can all be spoiled actually by the presence of tobacco, because it's such a martial plant.
Absolutely. I mean, imagine if it dominates the plant kingdom like it does human lives,
Exactly.
I mean, that's the thing, right? Is that the soul is, like we're saying, like it's a medium for all of this. And so even little changes, its experiences are going to essentially have a, impact on the work that you're doing. Like, I think the analogy you brought up is a perfect example of that, like chewing herbs, for example, before reciting an incantation. You want something sympathetic to the work, because that way, the soul's joining to things that are sympathetic with the purpose, which possess the virtues for what you're trying to engage with. And so consequently, everything kind of adds together. And I think spirit contact in some ways is kind of similar to that. It's a joining of two forces and communication by some means that you're hoping that the spirit's going to impress on these parts of the soul. That's kind of why I brought it up, because you want spirits to impress on the soul. You want them to move on the soul. I'm going to bring up some more evidence towards that actually happening, or at least that being a prominent idea soon. But I felt like it was important to kind of preface all this, because frankly, growing up in the so-called Western world, we tend to have an innate distrust of this kind of spirit contact that isn't verifiable with the physical eyes or ears, or something obviously spiritual in nature. I wrestled with that myself.
Yeah, and it's funny. I was born in Eastern Europe, but very much was raised. I moved to the West at a very young age, and that was a major jarring thing for me. Is going from and to be clear, this is not like to say that this is exactly how things are in capital cities or in major towns, in Eastern Europe, but like in the villages, where I spend a lot of my time, the vocabulary for spirit contact is so different, right? It's not assumed that just by saying that you saw a spirit that it was necessarily physical, nor that if it's not physical, that it was part of your imagination, that it was a phantasm, a fantasy. These words in our languages have certain connotations. They have psychological connotations, mental connotations. Not to say that the mind is not a part of this, powers. It absolutely is. The faculties of a medium, when you train them, hugely dependent on your mentality, on what you ate, on how you're feeling, on what your dreams were like that morning, on what your emotions are like towards, your closest people in your life and so on, right? Something I think about a lot is the fact that we have languages that have hundreds of words for things that we don't need. There's languages among the indigenous peoples of the northern provinces of Canada who have so many different words just for snow, and for them, that these differences are very, very tangible. They know exactly the difference between the snow that is best for this task versus that task versus something that is good for sledding, something that is good for hunting, something that is good for building, and so on and so forth, something that should be avoided. Same thing with cultures that don't differentiate as much between blue and green. They can differentiate between a whole number of hues and gradients within these colors, though, and have individual words for them to a degree that we don't really have. We have to invent them to make for paints and so on. So I think that in that same way, words shape culture, right? The language that you use when you have Isabel Gaudi talking about her familiar, not to say that it necessarily was a physical manifestation, though well could have been. It's just that people don't talk about spirit contact in the same way anymore. We kind of assume that if you saw a spirit and it wasn't a physical apparition, then it must have been something entirely private and mental, but it could have been sensory in many other ways, in terms of visions aren't necessarily truly the province of only the mind. You can have visions with your body, visions with your spleen, visions with your liver. And in my training, I was brought up to know the difference between these things. What is a heart vision like compared to a gut vision, a stomach vision, that kind of thing? And what is it like to feel spirits in different parts of your body? And what is it like to dream of spirits versus daydream of spirits? And is one more valid than the other? No, but daydreaming in a spirit-led sense isn't merely just kind of like having fantasies or whatever those mean, however we're defining that term right now. It's not really imagining things like when you're imagining two characters talking to each other. You can have your mind or your body or your spirit possessed in a certain way by a spirit who's making you obsessed with them and who's leading you down a certain path through daydreams, right? And taking up your time while awake and then occupying it as well while you sleep, for the better or for the worse, certainly.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that kind of, I guess, like daydreaming, so to speak, is something that even Ficino's student, De Aceto, who's a little openly, I suppose, Renaissance pagan his approach, he actively instructs us to kind of do that in Works of the Sun.
Mm-hmm.
And that might not be like communication in strictest sense, but like I find it hard to imagine for 1 second that the so-called imaginal is something that can be used as a one-way street. If it can facilitate a kind of sympathy or communion, then there's no reason why that same sympathy or communion could not facilitate vision or be impressed upon to do so. And our sources actually agree with exactly this, because Cone Vermeer points out that
the animal spirits played also an important part in angelology and demonology. It was problematic for theologians to explain how purely intellectual beings, like demons or angels, could act in the sublunar and material world. So they granted them a material, pneumatic part in the form of ethereal and sometimes aerial vehicles. They're visible, dependent on the density of the spirit, and can acquire different shapes. The pneumatic body, which is often identified with the animal spirits, is plastic and moldable and takes the form of the representations in the imagination of the demons. It is malleable, similar to the fetus, which is susceptible to the imagination of the mother. Analogously, demons act on humans by distributing their animal spirits and imagination. They cause strange fantasies and delusions, and tempt man into mortal error. Angels also affect the humorous and animal spirits to project true prophetic visions and God's messages into a purified imagination. But angels do not deceive, Thomas had argued, because they simultaneously enlighten the intellect to make true interpretations of the visions possible.
Thank you. Exactly. So you can see this idea isn't just this contemporary or like New Age thought, which is a criticism I've seen levied by people. It's actively part of the history of these practices. If you go elsewhere in the world, you will probably hear the exact same thing from the vast majority of folks out there. They might say, oh yeah, you have to confirm it somehow, but they're never going to, because how we see the imagination today is very much a new perception. It's a new idea. And I don't want to overemphasize the imagination in this case. As Svinga has said, there's a lot of other ways that things can be communicated. Even not just dreams, but also health, sensations in the body that aren't imaginable but physical,
sudden taboos.
Yeah, omens.
All three of us dealing with those at various points in our lives, including enduring, like, oh, that's just not a thing for me anymore, because that's a spirit is actively guiding me away from that so that I don't suffer worse things in the future.
That's exactly. I mean, in Chumashian, the immortals are sitting on your shoulders and your neck, so people aren't really meant to be touching you there, because that's like, you're going to disturb them, you're going to annoy them. Like, you don't want to piss off a weasel, he'll make you go mad. And I mean, it's like,
Yeah.
you go mad. It's just another example of someone moving the mind, right? Moving the thoughts. Like,
Could I just flag how desperately I want you to do a Chumashan episode, like on Northern Manchurian and like North Chinese, like folk magic? Like, that is genuinely one of the coolest traditions I've ever heard of, and it's all thanks to you and the elders that you have reached out to in that tradition that I'm even able to know anything about it.
it's been very fun investigating that one, despite my language skills.
Hey, but your Mandarin and Cantonese are just improving day by day, so.
True. Thank you.
Don't be so modest, my love. You're doing really well. You've been nailing those tones down.
But you see, yourself and Mr. Key are also the real mediums in the room. I am not too bad, if I say so myself, but I think in comparison, you guys are the real.
I'm gonna like side eye Key right now and be like, it's funny that he's saying this when he's the one who like will wake up in the morning and be like, I have a brand new treatise downloaded to my brain from my spirits, and tell us things that we end up verifying across cultures and across a pre-existing text that he's never read. So he's being very modest right now.
Legit. Like, sometimes I'll get a message from Salt at 3-4 in the morning, be like, hi, one of my spirits told me to write this, have a look at this, and it's a 50-page grimoire that seems like it's right out of 1650 Europe that he just translated, but really it's all channeled and verified to work by the spirits. Yeah.
And that's another form of spirit contact, right? It's like, I love that emphasis in the Spiritismo, that your faculties can manifest in different ways. You have mediums who can play instruments that they've never touched before because the musician spirit is around them, and for some people, that's not how their gifts go. Some people are very visual, others are very auditory, others are very physical, others are mounts and can do all of these things or none of these things in different ways. Some, hugely have a court full of incredibly literate and articulate spirits that will, see, someone like Salt and be like, you have these faculties, you should be writing like this. You should be putting our breath into flesh, and the flesh is paper and the blood is the ink. And there is a deep mystery there into how, the Bible itself, for example, the grimoires themselves are forms of divine energy, move through the souls of different spirits that adhere to those particular entire loci of power.
Yeah, definitely. Like, the manner in which spirits are impressing themselves upon the soul in that way, there are, as you mentioned, incredibly literate and intellectual spirits in what can admittedly be, very physical traditions at time, like, of course, Kimbanda, where when they come down, it's like you would expect them to, be acting in a certain way of how an Eshu would act, without getting into the detail. But then sometimes it's like, okay, I'm just going to go sit in the corner, speak French, and write a book. And it's like, there are these so many different ways in which these, instantiations of spirit into matter can occur, as was kind of quoted earlier as well.
Truly, yeah. I mean, I think, should we really start saying that there's no poet ever whose words are really the voice of spirits, inspiring him and moving him? Like, should we say, maybe someone with Saturn and Mercury is coming off as incredibly dry and depressing, but also pretty decent content. Like you say, like, some spirits will manifest themselves in ways that are very much intellectual pursuits and very much these kinds of movements that aren't explicitly, words or actions, but it's a way of that spirit to express itself. And again, that expression is itself a kind of contact. Like, it's an action that is visible and perceivable in some measure. Now, discerning that from, things that arrive innately from ourselves, that's the difficult part of this kind of thing. That's where the tension comes in, I think, and the difficulty in understanding how to discern what comes from oneself and what comes from one's spirit. And sometimes that's, in these cases, for example, with the inspiration, it's only necessary so far as it is to thank them, to show gratitude for help and support, which is yet another reason why we should kind of learn to do this in the first place. I think it's helpful to honor, but yeah, I mean, there's just so many ways that they're going to appear and show themselves to us. And this isn't just recognized by the elite and the clergy, right? We can also think about commentaries on how witchcraft and magic was generally perceived by external sources. These might not be the most friendly, okay? But even their arguments against magic can tell us a little bit about the subject. For example, the Canon Episcopi describes the belief in witchcraft as a heresy, specifically the belief that it can even be effective. And a core component of Canon's arguments lie in the fact that these witches and practitioners of magic, divination, and so on are experiencing delusions of the mind. The devil leads them astray by dreams, but this is not a physical thing. The devil is real. These phantasms and delusions, i.e., his communication with them, originate from him. But these are not physical events when they see themselves marching in the train of Diana and so on. It's merely a vision, according to the text. So, in other words, yes, the criticism isn't that they're physically engaging with spirits, as we see in some later accounts, but rather that the diabolical spirits are impressing themselves over these women in the imagination and the dreams. And we can look to the arguments made by Reginald Scott in respect to the delusions of magicians and the nature of their work as well. It's like, delusion is a strong word, but keep in mind these are critics of the practice, okay? But if they're criticizing this, then it's evidently a component of these practitioners' lives and their experiences and their contact with the spiritual. So, and there's a lot of things that can propel this. I mean, sometimes they're attributed to melancholy from a medical perspective, like Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy describes the influence of cholera as provoking visions and phantasms. And we might note that in the practice of magic, especially necromancy, black cholera is heavily associated with these kinds of magic as well as witchcraft. So this magic can even be seen as a consequence of possessing too much melancholy. So, for example, werewolves, again, is also a common stereotype there. But this, again, is highlighting the relationship of magic practitioners and the imaginal, as well as kind of where this comes from. But the fact that it's the critics doing this is kind of funny. But when it comes to magic in this era, you should always kind of examine what people who are against it are saying, because much as all those magicians picking up a copy of Discovery of Witchcraft and using the experiments in there that Scott's laughing at, well, I think critics are sometimes the magician's best friend, both for ego checking, but also, frankly, for resources.
Please preserve those traditions that you think are bullshit. Let us have the record of them.
Amen. Amen. Yeah, we have plenty of examples from witch trials and handbooks that like they're actively going out to practice and venerate the devil by many means. And I think we're all kind of familiar with those to varying degrees. But there's no denying that evidently many attitudes considered spiritual congress between magicians and their demons to be physical at times. No one's denying that. But it's also clear that some magical texts are written with the expectation of this, perhaps, or at least omens, such as the idea of omens preceding the spirit's arrival in various magical texts from the Middle Ages. And just as some, as pointed out by Nicolaus from Enodia Press in his book on Forced Sea Spirit, are clearly written with a more imaginal and visionary nature in mind. So there's a clear place for both of these perspectives within the purview of magic and how people communicated with spirits historically. That's the boring context and history out of the way in a very brief and summarized fashion. But what about actually doing it right, folks? Because that's what you're here for. I know it. With the spirits, how to communicate with them direct. And if you're a practitioner, you should want to know how to talk to the big guys hanging around you. So where do you think we should start with this, Key? I guess maybe you got started and whether it was easy for you.
Yeah, so for me, it was quite the arduous task. It takes, I will start with the warning that this is a matter of effort and practice and even more practice. And when you think you couldn't practice anymore, you're practicing for another couple hours. And, I just wanted to also say that, like, the best place to start would be if you are in community and have teachers of these topics, the particular culturally contextualized form of meditation, prayer, contemplation, explicit mediumship training, what have you, would be a good place to start. So, ask your teacher, your sifu, your godparent, whatever have you, be like, hey, can I get some help with this? So with that disclaimer out of the way, I just wanted to begin by, really concretely bringing the ability of a spirit to impress upon so many different parts of the soul and impress on those parts in an equally varied and myriad set of ways. And to do that, one of the best exercises that I would recommend is, to start by exploring the often amorphous boundaries along which these impressions can occur to you. And the you is what we're trying to figure out here, because that is often, where that ends and where a spirit, or spirits plural, begin is tricky a lot of the time, as was expressed and discussed by Salt earlier, where we are bringing two souls together to interact with each other in particular ways. It's what happens when, you have initiations or multiple souls, or other pacts that are situated within the body that are like, okay, well, what happens when part of me that is now a plant or an animal or part of a spirit that is living in my body is the me that's interacting with another spirit? And needless to say, it gets weird, and gets weird fast. But one of the best ways to just kind of hang out and sit with yourself and find out where that you is what I would recommend. So
honestly, it is what I think you're an excellent person to discuss this with, because you had been for so long reminding us that you're one of like the most talented mediums that I know. Like, your spirit perception is exceptional. No, it's true. I'm not saying that because you're my friend. Like, it really, like, I'm saying it because you've seen things about my spirits that no one else has seen. You've seen things about other people's spirits that like shock them. But at the same time, you didn't have the background that people might assume of you. It wasn't like, oh, phenomenally sensitive child who's seeing the ghosts and stuff like that people just kind of assume it comes with that. You're just the proof that the hard work is what it is. There's people who come in to traditions of possession never having had an experience in which they might have been seen as like touched by the spirits, and then they mount immediately, and it's intense, and stuff like that. There's people who are mounts in other traditions and who then come into a new one and don't mount that at all, and that's more on the spirits than is on them. But it also could be a lot on them and the way that they perceive their role in that situation, the things that the pacts they have. These things are incredibly varied. The reasons why you see your spirits really clearly on one day and then don't at all on another day can be as simple as diet, can be as simple as the stress that you feel, and also will color the way that you see them, right? When you're stressed, you're going to see them in a way that's different from when you're calm. And I really appreciate you always stressing the importance of practice, right? Of diligence, of it's not just as much as there are many ways and many initiations that will open your sight, that will open your faculties. What happens once you're out of that area of effect, if you will? What happens when you've moved through that space in which the conditions were so ripe because you were standing in an area that was consecrated for that purpose, and were immersed in that atmosphere? What happens when you come home? Can you still do it with your job, with your house, with your life? Can you still approach it in the same way?
Yeah, definitely. Exactly as you said, there's more than one way to skin a cat to train mediumship, but there's also way more ways to completely throw that off. And learning how to navigate each of those, trials and tribulations and difficulties is really where people, I think need the most encouragement, because all of a sudden, if you're hanging out one day and you're like, this is awesome, the spirits are really flowing through me, I'm seeing them all over the place, I'm hearing them, I'm having these great conversations, the magic is popping off, and then the next morning you wake up and it's like there's nothing going on. It's like, okay, what happened? And it can be discouraging, it can be frustrating, but you still gotta set out the offerings, do your thing, and just have trust in your spirits, and have trust in the abilities that you are explicitly cultivating, because it's like you don't suddenly stop being what you were the day before. You were a medium yesterday, you were still a medium today, you're just having problems with it, and you can really get into that. So for the listeners out there, encouragement.
Yeah, and it's really important, I think. Just wanted to emphasize, because I think this is something that you've really helped me a lot in the many hours that we've spent, across, many years at this point, trying to hone our skills together, is that you're a matrix of pacts and relationships, and those are born out of emotions. Witchcraft itself is born of emotion. The pacts and agreements in those relationships are emotion based. So having a better understanding of what brings you back to yourself when your emotions, even emotions that are not yours but are being oppressed upon you by spirits, and how that's coloring everything, is essential.
Yeah, just being able to ground yourself in something and just be like, okay, I know what's up. I have a view of what's going on that's not, obviously it's going to be colored by your emotions, but having the discernment and the restraint to choose to act upon them in a way that isn't blind, as we said, you can be possessed by an emotion.
Yeah.
And exactly as you discussed it, what happens when the spirit you're dealing with is your own anger?
Yeah, what happens when you say something along the lines of like, "Oh, I don't know what came over me. What was that all about?" And it was your anger. It was your pride. It was your desire to be the center of the attention in the room. It was your desire to be validated when you feel like everyone else is talking to everyone else and you're alone. It's your desire to be seen as an authority, to be seen as someone who can transmit information, even when you're the furthest thing in the room from an authority on what you're trying to talk about. It's your desire for someone to comfort you. All of these things can, influence the way that you move into space, including a space full of spirits that are watching and noticing these things and then deciding how they're going to behave and turn to you. It can manipulate all manner of things to act in ways that pretend to be things, like, the amount of times in divination sessions I've had to note to somebody, this isn't what you think it is, this is something else. My spirits are telling me that this is a being pretending to be what you think it is, in order to sate a deep-seated desire for you to communicate and be seen as an authority in a certain realm, or be seen as special, or connected to something that is rare and precious and exciting to you. But it's an aesthetic preference, not an actual spiritual connection. And when you devote a lot of your energy to something, there are things in the world that will move like and swarm like insects to take that form, to fill that space. It's like a statue that you keep talking to, but you don't dedicate to a spirit in a certain way or consecrate to them. Something will live in there because you're talking to it, and it may not be the thing that you think it is.
Yeah, I think you guys capture it perfectly here. We were even discussing a second ago, right? Like the inspiration and like frenzies that come from, people who write poetry. Like sometimes they're possessed by the desire to do that, and then they end up procrastinating and doing that instead of what they should be doing, because those spirits are kind of pushing. So you kind of need to understand what's you, what isn't, and how that all fits in.
That just reminds me, there was this really, interesting article that I was reading that was written by a Sufi mystic who was discussing the figure of Al-Qadir, the green one, in like Islam and Sufism. And he recommended, saying Assalamu alaikum, any time that you talk about him, because it's like he might be the conversation you're having right now. He might be the inspiration you had to just write down everything you wrote down for the last 20 minutes. And of course, a favorite of the podcast, Ibn Arabi, claimed his, initiations directly from Qadir and his inspiration from this figure. So with all this in mind, how to see spirits, lesson 0 is how to look upon your own soul in a way that is conducive to everything we're talking about. So the first step, and going back to what Sfinga just described, is to wash from yourself all your preconceived notions about what's going on, to wash away from yourself all the stress, all the weirdness, all the bullshit that's on you from your day at work, or if anything's off, just take a minute to chill. Even going as far, you can physically cleanse off with stuff, but that of course is doing things to the soul. So just kind of vibe. Then sit and be like, okay, let's get a good frame of reference for what's going on. I'm just going to think, where is my body right now? Because, of course, as we discussed, there are these intricate, almost physiological channels of different souls that are connecting your body to your soul. There's something you are kind of the soul that is the rational faculty in there, but you're also, the physicality of everything going on. So it's just to sit with the body and see what the sensations are, because when things are not necessarily impressing themselves upon you, you want this base state to determine, okay, something is impressing on me now because it changed. So you just kind of scan yourself head to toe, feeling out what's going on. Then you want to go through the souls that we described. What is the emotive sensations you're feeling beyond the physical? We're going kind of up the ladder higher and higher in this cosmology, this chain of being. And we're seeing, what are my emotions right now and how are those interacting with the body? If I'm feeling like really angry, it's like, okay, well, I feel now my anger, but I also feel, the physical manifestation of that anger as it's impressing on me. It's in tension in my shoulders. It's, the fire in my chest and stomach. And understanding what all these feelings are in that moment is also really important, because you're just, again, examining the souls that can be impressed upon. Then as you move up the souls, you think about, what am I thinking about and where is that in relation to the emotions I'm feeling and in terms of the body. If you have a bunch of things still on your mind from life, because life is life, you just want to be aware, because what happens when a spirit is going to grab one of those thoughts and hold it in front of your face and say, you need to think about this right now, because a day from now something weird is going to happen with this situation. You want to preempt it with sorcery. And so it's just keeping, again, core to this practice is this idea that spirit communication is not always, and in fact is almost in the minority, something whispering in your ear or showing up in front of you as a person being like, hey, what's up? It can just be a sensation, a fleeting moment where you're like, oh shit, I gotta do this thing now. Or, oh wow, I'm actually really feeling something that I've been not addressing. Let me address that in whatever way the spirit needs to get the message across. And what happens as well when your spirits are not going to be vocal to you? What if they're, as we discussed in kind of the first part of this episode, what if they're a dream that is on you? The spirit is the dream itself, or the spirit is in the dream, or the spirit is an emotion. The spirit is, something that will only impress upon you as a feeling in like a bone in your body, or in like a particular muscle twitch or something like that. And it's learning again and again to speak these different languages, and that all begins with knowing how to even receive messages outside of the ears and eyes and mouth. And that is kind of what this framing does. So once this is done and you're feeling like you have a good picture of what's happening around you, one of the easiest things to contact would be, of course, if you want to start engaging with the spirit right away, look at what's going on around them, just without any preconceived notions, without any ideas of what it could or couldn't be. Just be like, okay, where are these person's ancestors? Where are my ancestors? Where are my familial dead who are going to be around? Because every human and or other incarnated being is going to have some progenitor to it. And just saying, where everyone has these spirits, they can certainly move mountains as potent forces in our spiritual arsenals with only a candle and a glass of water once you cultivate that relationship. But you just kind of look around and be like, okay, I'm not even going to get bogged down in what's happening. There's just, here's a guy, here's something, and looking at each of these spirits and just being like, okay, you're a spirit that exists, moving on. Because of course they might try to impress something on you in that moment, but really you don't even need to necessarily mind about that at that moment, because you're just seeing, okay, what's going on over here? Are there even spirits? Which of course there will be in this exercise, because you're looking for spirits that literally every person alive has. But you just kind of want to see where they're at, and then go down the line as you see each of them, be like, okay, who are you, and see what that impression may be. And then it's like, okay, cool. Thanks for the impression. Who are you? Okay, cool. Thanks for the impression. And you now have a way of communicating with these spirits because you know their presence by that impression. And from there, everything becomes possible.
I really like what you just said about, the way that we can, because there's different ways to train these things, right? This is just what happened to work for you, right? In your particular practice, it's like starting off with noting spirits around you and then just moving on. Oh, there's an ancestor. There's someone I have no idea who that is. I don't know who that you are either. Oh, that might be another ancestor. Oh, that's a familiar that I actually knew. I know who that is. That might be some emissary of this one deity I prayed to when I was 14. I don't know who you are, but it's keeping the inventory, right? And you can do that with your scrying your ancestors. You can do that with scrying photographs of your family members, of other people. You and I have a particular tendency to look at like celebrities and be like, who's protecting this rapper? Who's protecting this politician? Who's praying for you? Oh, that is your grandma. Wait, am I right? Is this person have Russian ancestry? Oh my God, they are Russian. That makes sense. I know I saw images of these particular things I associated with, Russian Orthodox buildings, that kind of thing. Oh, your grandma goes to church for you. It's that kind of thing, and it's just whatever you're right about, you can confirm later, and whatever you're wrong about, you can confirm later too, right? It's one of those things that like, it's helpful to first begin by taking inventory and to kind of note what are your emotions. Oh, I'm a cluster of souls, as are we all. But, oh, that's the part of me that does this. That's the part of me that's dreading that, once I log off this voice call with one of you guys, I have to go do this chore that I'm really not looking forward to. Oh, there's the part of me that's still processing some anger that I feel towards a coworker, let's say, and that kind of thing. It's a myriad options that will interrupt the flow of this. So if you don't get caught up in it, if you just let it pass, just let it be. This is why meditation practice is exceptionally helpful, for those of us who tend to narrate a lot of things in our minds, let alone process things in such a way. But, really truly for anybody, it can be really good for discerning like, oh, that was more me, and then before you even get into advanced stuff of like, I'm not even sure if advanced is the right word for it, but it's more along the lines of like being able to get into, okay, well, what is this kind of spirit? Like, what is going on here? How are they impressing their protection of this person? Who is halting this person's progress? What is a roadblock? Are they like crossing themselves in some way? Are they cursing themselves in some way? Do they have the eye on them? What's going on? Those kinds of things, and getting around wards or and that kind of thing. I feel like this is a great start because it really just centers back on yourself. Because how are you supposed to consistently, one thing is having an intense experience with the spirit where they come down like the lightning and they become physically manifest, and it's a lot. Another thing is getting an amazing reading from someone that rocks your life, and then you start to reframe things in your life in a certain way. But do you keep that habit? How hard is it to do that? You know what I mean? Like, it's very difficult to keep a habit that you're just trying to build. It's very difficult to be like, oh, I feel my spirit strongly when I'm around other people who accept their reality, who are in the same kind of ontological metaphysical bubble, who kind of like, we're all acknowledging, yes, that's what we saw. Yes, we underwent the shared initiation experience where on a land that is hyperactive because of so many things buried on it. And then you go home, right? You go home to your life, and not just like your shrines, but you go home to your life, right? Your job, your frustrations, your all these other things. How do you keep that, right? And it's by reminding yourself that you're the center of that. You can undergo incredible things, and you'll think, well, now there's no excuse. Now I know for sure that this is a way I could do it. I know for sure spirits are capable of these things. I will never again doubt that these things, these miracles are possible. And then you rely on them, right? Then you get frustrated with your spirits when they don't manifest for you in very obvious ways. Disruption is a major way by which you can think. Salt, do you remember when you and I got like that big, the complete system of magic, like William Doss and Bellhouse? It came out of like a Society for Esoteric Endeavor a while back.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So he's a scry, he's a galvanist, he's a cunning man, he's a many things from Essex. And he was a remarkable gentleman. 19th century, he had a lot of magical books, including very much, a fourth book of occult philosophy was a major, part of that. But one of the things that he did was he would, do scrying with somebody, and he would have you look, if you were his client, he would have you look at the scrying implement, whether it was like a cylinder, whether it was like a ball, an egg, and then he would touch you the leg or something like that, and that would disturb you, right? Like, especially imagine if you're a woman, that would be like, what the hell is this guy doing? Is he trying to come on to me? But the disruption, as creepy as that is, would often be enough for the person to see something. So I think that, that is super creepy, but in a in a more consensual environment, in which somebody is undergoing initiation, for example, and is and understands they're not going to know what's going to happen until it happens, but there will be things that will cause discomfort and will intentionally shake you a little bit loose out of your ego, so you can see things, you can feel your spirits that are being put into you, these kinds of things are being impressed upon you. Discomfort is a major thing, and what is more discomforting and disquieting than having to face the parts of yourself that come up in meditation that are a little scary, that are a little uncomfortable? But knowing them and recognizing them will help, in any tradition, I think, at least, make spirit contact more fluid. And that's something that I've seen you, Key, go through immensely, is just like your ability to center yourself and go back to yourself and be like, that was my anger, that was my pride, that was my sadness, that was my grief, that was my joy. That's an ancestor who really wishes that I had a different job and who is just on my ass right now. Like, those kinds of things are remarkable. Like, you are really good at that, and you became really good at that very quickly by taking all the lessons that you share with me, including just this one snippet of one. This is just like this is a prologue to a prologue of like the many things that you've done to learn how to see spirits very seriously, and doing it every day, even if you're sore from the gym, even if you're tired from life, even if you'd rather be spending some time playing video games than being on a voice call with a friend. You did that, and I think that's absolutely tremendous. It's a great reminder to everybody, including no matter where you are in your practice, to never think yourself that you're better than or that you're above serious dedication like that.
Yeah, and one of the major lessons out of that as well is learning to just kind of brute force it at times, where if nothing is going right, just everything is kind of annoying, and it's like all this like bullshit's going on in my life. Just learning to sit down and just be like, okay, you know what, the bullshit's going to be going on whether I'm practicing or not, so I might as well just practice through it all. And I was just going to say, in those times there will be moments where you have a day where let's say you have a battery of like 5 photos in front of you, and it's like the exercise is, okay, scry all these people, tell me which one of them is a magician, and tell me things about the spirits of all 5 of them. And you just get it all wrong. Like, nothing is right. You're completely off base. It's like just learning how, that obviously sucks, but just learning to be like, okay, cool, I was wrong today, moving on, I'll be right tomorrow.
Exactly.
I think that's a real big stickler for some folks. Yeah, it's just a frustration with being wrong. Regarding the points you made as far as like disturbances and having to overcome them and kind of get past all that stuff that kind of makes things a bit more difficult. I mean, I think that's really relevant when it comes to conjuring spirits who aren't necessarily the amicable spirits that we love and cherish and have deep relationships with, or even just the kind of less affectionate perhaps, but distant relations of some kind, like lineage spirits that you don't really know or are a bit wild and just don't like people but are kind of part of the lineage still, like that's fine. But what about spirits like, let's say you're picking up for sort of spiritum texts and you conjure up one of the demons from there? What do you think is going to happen when this guy's chattering in your ear, like chattering and nattering away? It's not going to be pleasant. It's not just going to be one little voice. It's going to be all these senses, all these discomforts and horrible feelings. Your anger is going to be provoked because these spirits rejoice in that kind of thing, right? They love it. And so if you want to step into the circle and bring the hammer down on some wicked, unclean spirits, then you need to be able to push through that kind of miasmic feeling, this kind of disturbance of the self, which accompanies these rites, because they're inherently tension-based. They're difficult, they're hardy rituals. So if that's the kind of magic you want to do, and I find especially people who want to do this kind of magic seem to run into problems with talking to spirits the most out of any group I've seen, then you need to push past it. You need to be able to kind of just keep tracking along and be like, oh, that's nice, goodbye, whatever, I don't care. So anyway, about this thing you owe me. It's crucial.
Yeah, there's something that comes to my mind as well, is just like, and this works for anything in life, but trying to make sure that you don't let like discouragement be the enemy of the practice and the work, because we're always doing the work. Like, we're always projecting things. We're always transmitting information, as my godfather likes to say, we're always transmitting. It never stops, and so we always transmit to our spirits, right? And when they test us, as they will, as is their right to, when they put things in our paths to see how we'll react to them. When they intentionally withdraw from our senses to see if we still will even show up at their shrines, that kind of thing. It's like I said at the beginning of the episode, right? Like there are amazing magical works that, and results that we've all accomplished in sessions with our spirits in which we felt and saw nothing because we were destroyed that day. The whole reason we came to the shrine to do this was because we needed it done and we weren't in the mental space sometimes. And yes, emotions and anger and these things, self-righteousness, all of these things can facilitate other kinds of spirit contact, but it will filter things, right? Like tobacco, it will filter the effect. And yet things still work. It still happened because you have been showing up to that shrine, feeding it and tending to it for years, right? So it's not like it suddenly goes dark when you need it most. Quite the opposite. You don't necessarily even have to see things. You can just trust that the connection is there and that they are listening. And sometimes they will hide themselves from you, right? They'll sit on the rafters when you're looking across from you at their vessel, being like, "Where are you, man?" And you don't realize that they're watching you like a hawk from above. These kinds of things. So they're under the ground, slithering. And maybe you're not at the point where you even thought to check that, or you even thought to feel drawn to that direction, or you dismissed the impulse to do so because you thought, "Oh, that must have just been a stray thought," right? But they are there. And so if you have a robust court of allies or are even the process of cultivating one, these are all things to keep in mind. It's to ensure that I like episodes like this where we can share a bit more of our personal practices without going into too much detail, to just suggest, something I think is really important, which is none of this is linear. And more things are possible than you might think, and doesn't mean that you are doing things incorrectly, but these are necessary skills to develop. They're not a crutch to be like, "Oh, nothing's happening to me if I don't see anything," far from it. But it is something that, mediumship is an essential part of trance, is an essential part of sorcery in many ways, because that is how you negotiate with spirits. That is how you're able to perceive certain nuances, right? And there are people for whom they are purely impressions. They're like flurries of impressions. Like, I feel these things, and now I'm writing this down, and suddenly I have a list, and I check with divination. Never mind, it's approved. Yep, it works. This is the list. Nothing more needs to be added. Oh, one other thing that needs to be done to the list that was approved, and so on and so forth. And it was not a voice. It was not a sight. It was impressions. It was many, like a waterfall of impressions. And how do you know that that's coming from someone other than you? Because that person knows what they feel like when they're bursting with creativity, even when that creativity is influenced by spirit, and they know that this came from something because they felt that heat in the back of their eyes, they felt that cold in the depth of their stomach, they felt the pain in this one joint that they know is that spirit's calling card, and they know they're there, and that even if they're not hearing or seeing things in the way that we might assume must necessarily happen for us to have valid spirit contact, they're having it exceptionally well, and their magic is working.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think impressions are one of the primary ways that this all occurs. Like, it's not even just voices or conversational in nature. It's just, a sense. And it's one that becomes easier to understand the implicit meaning of over time as you deepen your understanding of the spirit and the way it talks. It's another language all on its own. Each spirit talks its own language. Like, you can have two spirits from the same kind of line, like even related in some ways, but no one talks very chattily through the voice, and the other one, maybe he talks really appetites through the desires for certain things, like especially, you mentioned it earlier, but like things you don't normally desire but suddenly do can quite often be that. I mean, when you're pregnant, you have all these food cravings. I mean, yes, it's partly the natural spirit, but also, I mean, when you're like that, you've got so many spirits around you. Ancestors are keeping an eye on you because, that's their progeny. That's the continuation of the line. There's just so much going on. And like we also mentioned earlier, like all of that's also being impressed on the fetus. It's being, ensouled. The virtues are descending into it in varying degrees as its body's constructed. Like, this is, it's very much a process of many different ways. It's a dynamic matter, like you said. Like, there's just so many different ways, and depending on the spirits you have and yourself, your innate temperaments, that's going to vary. I know people who talk mostly through inspiration, who mostly do it by actually conversing by images only. Like, they can't converse, they struggle to have a dialogue in that way, and so the spirits come, okay, we can adapt to that a little bit, that's okay, at least for now. Work on that in the future though. But how it all happens is it's just gonna vary. It's diverse. And that's just like spirits. It's just like people. Like, there's no one true way to do it. I think On the other hand, it is always very valuable to authenticate and verify these things, and with divination especially like if it's important, even more so. I think, just getting a small impression, going, "Oh, hey, Mr. Spirit," is one thing, but like, if you're asking, "Hey, what's this guy's spirits like?" and you're telling him that, well, you should be checking up, you should be verifying that, of course. Like that's just part and parcel of it. You want to make sure any important information is confirmed, because divination is yet another way that they're going to speak to you. Oracles would sit down, listen to the wind, natural omens in the natural world, like, "Oh, how's the wind moving the leaves?" Or maybe, and this is an example, the Immortal Family practices, they will burn incense, and how bright is the incense? How dark is it? Is the smoke descending? Oh, that's a bad sign. Is the smoke black? Oh, it's a lot of yin. Like that kind of thing is fundamental to it. And that's a way that the spirits are going to communicate with people. And it's even how they're going to communicate with each other, because usually when you're looking at incense, like Kanxiang, the immortals are possessing you, they're on your body, they're literally kind of piloting you.
Mm-hmm.
And so these immortals are literally using the incense to communicate with the other immortals, or to communicate with the forces that are moving the incense. So don't rule out divination either, because even spirits apparently use that to communicate with each other.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, divining spirits that teach you to be a better diviner through divination, right? Spirits that give you incense recipes that when you burn, you get better at making incense recipes. This is a real thing. That was a whole part of excellent book on the art of magic. I just love that concept. That it's a big part of my practice. The witch spirits that make you a better witch, the necromancers that make you a better necromancer. It's a real thing, and I've had many conversations with our friend Dr. Al Cummins on this matter.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to talk about like using divination tools as well, the spirit of the tool itself is going to be bridging, kind of acting as an intermediary between you both. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and knowledge and refinement of that system is learning how to communicate with the spirit of those tools as well. It's all like we say, like there's just so many different ways this is all ongoing, and it's all approaching. Just like the soul is literally involved in every single thing you do, because it's as Aquinas said, animating principle of life.
Mm-hmm. You bet. Well, all right, gentlemen, that was lovely. And not only that, but I think that perhaps this might be the time to tease something, Key. Are you feeling up for it?
Yes. Yeah, let's no time like the present, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So as a teaser, or more an explicit announcement at this point, on our website, cunningandcommand.com, I will be launching consultation services, specifically focusing on mediumship development, where I just kind of walk people through the tips and tricks that help me develop mediumship, and just work with you and your spirits through consultation and divination to find some method or methods that work for everyone on kind of an individualized basis.
I'm really excited about that, because the trial clients you've been taking on have been raving about this, in terms of like, you have a really excellent approach of being patient, of being kind, compassionate, but firm, and like actually divining with a person about their court if they're not familiar with who's in it yet, helping them get to the point where they can perceive it themselves, very individual coaching, really like deep diving into the nitty gritty of their courts, and like, what is their practice like? What do they feel that needs to be addressed? That individual coaching ability is incredibly beautiful, and I think you're the perfect person to offer that sort of thing, because you have the direct experience that of just how much your library of like techniques that you've shown me, from the far reaches of Franz Barden to like very specific techniques that come from traditions that you have license and initiation, and combined into the general principles of what works in those situations, and that being like, okay, if this doesn't work for you, let's try this instead. And that's really gotten a lot of people very far. I'm very, very proud of you, and I'm really excited that you're doing this. So keep an eye out with cunningandcommand.com for Key's services. And if you have an interest in being an early adopter of this, please go to our contact page and email us, and let Mr. Key here know, Mr. Barrelstone, that this is something that you'd be interested in being on the waitlist for, because the spots are going to be very limited. And if it's anything like what's been happening so far with the trial clients, it's going to go up quickly. And on that note, please be sure to follow us on Twitter /Frightful Howls, and support us on Patreon at patreon.com /The Frightful Howls. Salt's Almanac, all of our cool extra lore and things, our show notes, our Q&As, episode suggestions, and more. We appreciate each and every one of you, and it means the world to us whenever we see all the engagement that we've been getting on Instagram and certainly in the Q&As. So thank you all so much. We hope you had fun, and keep your eyes posted, because this is a recurring theme. We're going to have, in addition to research episodes like we've had in the past, as well as some more personal episodes in terms of techniques and experiences like this one, we'll be having plenty more soon on conjuration, on witchcraft, more on scrying and spirit contact in very specific traditions, more on shapeshifting. We have quite a fun retinue coming up, and we're working on some guest appearances. So without further ado, we got some Akashic Records for today. My song choice is Louis Armstrong's Spooks, classic for all the spooky, scary, wonderful things that can come out in the dark. And yourself, Key?
Yeah, so my Akashic record for the day is Last Night I Had a Vision by Eczema the Obia Man.
Eczema himself.
Yeah.
We love Eczema the Obia Man, and love all of his work for the most part. But yeah, that album specifically is amazing. And now I have The Seance of the Sixth Fret, which can be maybe a runner-up as an excellent, although maybe we can save that one for a Seance episode, but whatever. Seance on the Sixth Fret as well, because that entire album is amazing and gold. But yeah, and thank you so much to Salt, especially for giving us some context. Look forward to more on that as we dive into some of the people we mentioned today in more depth in their own episodes in the future. And without further ado, what's our license to depart?
So the license to depart today, continuing in the fashion of it not being a true dismissal of spirits, is a oration from the Ars Notoria, as we reference today, which, as says the grimoire, provoketh and procureth memory.
Oh, hell yeah.
So here beginneth the prologue of this oration. I beseech thee, O my Lord, to illuminate the light of my conscience with the splendor of thy light. Illustrate and confirm my understanding with the sweet odor of thy spirit. Adorn my soul, that hearing I may hear, and what I hear I may retain in my memory. O Lord, reform my heart, restore my senses, and strengthen them. Qualify my memory with thy gifts, mercifully open the dullness of my soul. Most merciful God, temper the frame of my tongue by thy most glorious and unspeakable name. Thou who art the fountain of all goodness, the original and spring of piety, have patience with me. Give a good memory unto me, and bestow upon me what I pray of thee in this holy oration. O thou who dost not forthwith judge a sinner, but mercifully waitest, expecting his repentance, I, though unworthy, beseech thee to take away the guilt of my sin, wash away my wickedness and my offenses, and grant me these my petitions by the virtue of thy holy angels, thou who art one God in Trinity. Amen. Amen.